15 years ago, I was working in my first real job. It was here in Boston. I hired a guy. He fell way behind on a major deadline. And I sat at my desk one day when a senior leader in our company walked over to his desk, started screaming at him, and said, "If you don't get your act together, you're going to be fired." And I watched this happen, and I had a choice to make. Do I speak up, or do I stay silent? And I know my whole life, I've been the person who stayed silent. In elementary school, I remember getting called to the principal's office. I got there. I found out I was not in trouble, and I still cried. After that trauma, I followed every rule, but also made a list of rules that didn't even exist yet, and followed those too just in case. But I felt like I had to do something in that situation. So I looked around the organization, and I found the person I knew would have my back. It was my boss's boss. She had nominated me for an award once. She dropped by my desk every week to talk about Survivor, which meant I had to watch Survivor. And I marched into her office and I said, "I think this is a terrible injustice. No one should ever be treated this way. But I'm also worried he's going to quit. And if you think we're behind now, just wait until he leaves." Deep breath. Nothing bad happened. Except then my boss's boss is dragging me down the hallway and shoving me into a dark room. The light goes on. I'm completely disoriented because I realize I'm somewhere I've never been in my entire life, right in the middle of the women's bathroom. Turns out that's the only room on our floor with no windows. And my boss's boss says, "If you ever speak out out of turn again, you're going to be fired." That led me to a few decisions. The first one was that I never wanted a real job where someone could fire me. This was the appeal of university tenure. The second decision was that I was going to go and become an organizational psychologist and study how we could fix broken workplaces and get real cultures of respect and support and understand how we could build resilience in organizations when people go through bad experiences like that to give them the strength to persevere. And then the third goal was to never again enter a women's bathroom. Check. So I went off to grad school, and the first organization I got to work with was a fire department. I heard through a friend of a friend that they were struggling with culture. And I walked in and I did a simple survey. And I said, "What are the 3 things that would most improve your life in this fire department?" And I got the data back, and the #1 answer was, get rid of the women. Over a quarter of the firefighters said the single most important thing that could be done to improve their lives at work was to kick women out of their organization. And I was horrified. And that, I think, was the beginning of my conversion into a feminist. Because prior to that, I thought it's the 21st century. We're long past evaluating people on their gender. We value people for their contribution. And I could not have been more wrong. So I started digging into data on what causes work life to be so challenging for women, and how can we create a better world of work. And the first thing I came across was blind auditions in orchestras. I'm sure you're all familiar with the evidence that when orchestras just put up a curtain so that you could only hear the music being played and not see who was playing it, that all of a sudden women were allowed in when before they had been kept out. But the story doesn't end there, because when researchers tracked orchestras across 4 countries and asked what happened when they let women in, they found that as women joined, satisfaction of the men in the orchestras dropped, and the quality of the music dropped too. Men were threatened by the presence of women, and they responded a lot like the firefighters did. And only when women got to 40% representation did satisfaction and quality go up. And I walked away from that thinking, we need to better understand how to build resilience in organizations where women who face those kinds of situations can find the strength to say, you know what, I'm not going to give up just because a bunch of men don't respect me and don't tolerate me. And I had an opportunity to think about that in a lot more depth when I started doing some research and writing about this topic. And I ended up running into Sheryl Sandberg, and she started grilling me about gender differences in my data. I didn't have a lot of the answers, so I took a long flight back to the East Coast, and I reanalyzed a decade of my own data. And I was shocked by what I found. Really basic patterns in what I thought were pretty egalitarian organizations. Like, for example, that when men spoke up with ideas and suggestions, they were celebrated for it. Whereas when women spoke up, they were either barely heard or they were judged as too aggressive. And I think that's unacceptable. I think we need to change that situation. And I want to talk about a few of the things that I've learned about what it takes to build resilience if you live in that kind of world. And warning, yes, there will be a little bit of mansplaining here. But hopefully it's going to be data-driven. The first thing that I've learned is that one thing that women struggle a great deal at that men don't is self-compassion. I think we all know what it means to be compassionate toward others. We forget that we need to bring compassion inward toward ourselves. There's a great psychologist, Kristen Neff, who found that when men fail or struggle, what they often do is they blame other people or the situation. Whereas women internalize it, and they say, this is my fault. What did I do wrong? And Kristen thought, this is a tragedy, because very often failures and challenges are not our fault. And she said, what if you could just become more self-compassionate and not respond like this? So she designed a series of experiments. And in one of my favorite experiments, people were just brought in, and they were asked to think about a failure, a difficulty. It could be something as simple as forgetting your lines in a school play, not making a sports team, or something that challenged you at work. And she randomly assigned some people to write about why they were great human beings anyway and build up their self-esteem. But she assigned another group to show themselves the same kindness that they would offer to a good friend. And the way they did that was she asked them to write a letter about what they would say to a friend who had experienced this failure. And that group that wrote the letter was 40% happier and 24% less angry after doing that, being able to get a little bit of distance from their problem. And I think the more self-compassion we find, the easier it is to bounce back and even bounce forward when we struggle. One of my favorite examples of how to do this at work comes from Carolyn Everson. Carolyn works at Facebook, and she decided one day that she was going to take her performance review and share it with her team internally. So she posted it in her team's Facebook group. And the performance review came out, and people were shocked. Who would put their weaknesses, their areas for improvement out there? But Carolyn said, you know what? I don't want to spend a lot of energy hiding what I'm not perfect at. And if I can admit my mistakes to other people, then I'm going to have more compassion when I do run into them. And lo and behold, a lot of managers got excited about this, and they started doing it too. And they started trying to build a culture where everyone could look at their own mistakes and say, you know what, this happens to everyone. It's not just me. What was unusual about Carolyn is her team was 2,400 people. And so she shared her performance reviews openly with that many people. And I would love to see more organizations where people are allowed to do this. So I had a conversation with a group of students at Wharton where I teach. And they said, what if we got our faculty to be this open about our own failures? And I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. And here's a video of what came out of that.
What suggestions do you have for the Wharton Leadership Program? Have someone more relevant than Jeff Klein lead it.
Professor Lowe should go first to some undergrad or lower profile MBA programs and train herself how to teach before coming to school as reputable and with so high student expectations as Wharton is.
This is possibly the worst class I've ever taken in my life. Fair enough.
This course tries to accomplish too much at once and ultimately accomplishes nothing.
I mean, how embarrassing is it that we're being taught managing people at work by someone who's never managed anyone at work? That is ridiculous.
Pitkin can be so condescending. Yeah.
All I learned from Professor Sinkinson was how to bundle boring with difficult and to charge the price of an LT. I wouldn't even make a good bundle.
You remind me of a Muppet.
Professor Bluen dresses like a 50-year-old librarian. Really?
Why do you dress up so much for class? I understand wearing a suit, but the pocket square?
It makes me question maturity and cause me not to respect you as much.
This professor is a total but she's a nice That's sweet.
Prof. Sinkinson acts all down with pop culture, but secretly thinks Ariana Grande is a font in Microsoft Word.
The instructor repeated "on the other hand" and "in other words" a lot. Thanks for that feedback. I really appreciated it. On the other hand, who cares? In other words,
I have to tell you, every time I have showed that video in a classroom, the floodgates open. I get way more feedback than I've ever gotten before. The one thing that I never get feedback on is which Muppet. Still waiting for the answer. But there's something incredibly empowering and liberating about just putting those kinds of comments out there and then showing to other people, you know what, I can take this. And I think it's a great way to find self-compassion. Now, the second thing I've learned about building resilient workplaces is that, of course, we also need compassion for others. And this is where women dominate men. They feel more compassion, they express more compassion. But I think we often run into trouble, and this is true for men and women, figuring out how to best be there for other people and how to best support others. Sheryl Sandberg and I had a chance to explore this after her husband Dave died tragically. And we found that people constantly either didn't say anything or they said the wrong thing. We saw in workplaces of all kinds, when people went through professional and personal difficulties, that people just didn't know what to do. And so we began studying what should we say? How do you show support for other people when they go through adversity? And there are a few things that I found pretty powerful that captured mistakes I've made my whole life, and maybe a few of you have made them too. The first one was, whenever somebody runs into any kind of difficulty, my instinct was to try to cheer them up. Think positive. You'll feel better tomorrow. Everything happens for a reason. And that is the last thing people want to hear when they've experienced something bad in their lives. Because then they start feeling pressure to be happy. And the more pressure you feel to be happy, the more you get sad because you're not happy. And then you're not only unhappy, you're also unhappy because you're unhappy. And it's a vicious cycle. Instead, we found it works much better to just say, you know what, I understand that you may be going through something difficult, and I am here to listen. There's an incredible organization called the Dinner Party. It's a group of 20 and 30-somethings who have lost someone close to them, a loved one. And they gather for potlucks, and they hold what they call all feelings welcome dinner parties, where they don't worry about being judged. They don't try to encourage each other to feel anything. They say, look, all feelings are okay here. And I think providing people that space is a great way to allow them to explain what they've gone through. I think the more we can give people permission to express whatever they're going through, the more they will ultimately build resilience. And I think that's especially important moving into the holiday season, where a lot of people are expected to feel joy. But guess what? It is not a wonderful time of year for everyone. Second thing that I think a lot of us do wrong, that I screwed up royally, was whenever somebody would describe something bad they went through, my instinct was to say, me too. And not me too in the hashtag me too sense, but to grasp for something similar to say, I can relate to you, I can empathize. And as tempting as that is, when somebody says, you know what, I'm having a really hard time on chemo pills, what they don't want to hear is, I totally understand what you're going through. My cat was throwing up yesterday. What they want to hear instead is that you're curious about their experience. And I think one of the hardest things about facing adversity is that when you're in the thick of it, you end up looking at your problems through a microscope when you should be looking at them through a telescope. And so a great way to support other people is to say, tell me about something else difficult that you went through in your past, and how did you face it? And allow them to learn from their own strength that they've shown. Help them figure out, are there lessons they picked up in other tough moments that they might not be thinking about today? And help them find the confidence to say, you know what, I weathered a storm in the past, I can also weather one in the future. And otherwise, you end up in a situation where they feel like they're being lectured as opposed to supported. This happens way too often. Now, if I can offer you all some unsolicited advice, do not give unsolicited advice. It was a big takeaway from our research. This is something that, again, a lot of people do when they hear that somebody's gone through difficulty. They say, oh, well, here's what you should do to get better. And no one wants unsolicited advice ever. Instead, what we find if we look at the data is what people really want to hear is you will not go through this alone. I am going to be here for you and with you every step of the way. Or better yet, we are in this together. After Cheryl lost Dave, one of the things I heard over and over again was she would call and she would say, I'm so sorry to be bothering you. I don't want to be a burden to you. And eventually I said, you know what, I'm just going to ban the word sorry. You're not allowed to say it anymore. And she calls the next day and she says, I apologize. No, that doesn't count either. That's not okay. But I think it's so hard when people are suffering or struggling in any way for them to feel like it's okay to talk and to know we're in this together is such a simple way to give them the permission to share, to reach out, to ask for support. And I think that a lot of times people feel like when that doesn't happen, it's really hard to get the support they're looking for. And then the last mistake that we saw a lot of people make, which I have done pretty much every moment that I've ever been in where somebody else is going through hardship, is I've said, please let me know if there's anything I can do. And only now do I know that that shifts the burden to the person who's suffering, to know what they want and feel comfortable asking for it. Instead of offering anything, it's much better to just do something, to drop by with a home-cooked meal, to invite somebody out to the movies. These simple gestures, even if they're rejected, make it easy for the person who's in need to be able to say either a yes or a no. So Cheryl and I had a friend who had a great example of this. His son was sick in the hospital. And somebody showed up and sent him a text, and it said, I'm here in the hospital, and I'm going to be down here in the lobby for an hour for a hug, whether you come down or not. Such a simple offer. Another person texted and said, I'm bringing you dinner. What do you not want on a hamburger? And I think these small moves that we make, where we just make a specific offer, are sometimes the best thing we can do to support other people when they're going through difficult times. Now, taking this back into the workplace, I think the single most important thing that I've learned in the last decade and a half about how we can build resilience is that resilience comes from having organizations where women are in positions of power. And I think it's taken us way too long to get to those positions. And if you look at the conventional steps, yeah, of course it's taken too long. But if you look at the conventional steps organizations take to try to solve problems that women face, whether it's discrimination or harassment or bias, most of the conventional steps just don't work. And it usually starts like this. But then you see real action. You see leaders who say, I'm going to institute mandatory diversity training. I'm going to put in procedures for grievances, for airing concerns and complaints about harassment and bias. But when researchers studied these programs being implemented over 5 years, they found that they reduced the number of women in leadership roles significantly. And if you think about that, mandatory diversity training, one of the reasons it doesn't work so well is that there's a backlash from the men in particular, white men, who need to hear it most. And it makes them more biased rather than less. Grievance procedures are supposed to help, but a lot of organizations handle them poorly. And women get even more discouraged when they speak up. And what you know is 75% of women who blow the whistle, who raise concerns about harassment, face real retaliation and punishment. And so these systems, which are set up often with good intentions, tend to backfire. Now that's the depressing story. I think the encouraging story is the exact opposite is true when organizations set up mechanisms to make diversity a real priority. A diversity task force that says we have goals, and we're going to report to the CEO on how we can move the needle on representation of women, and especially women of color. You see a dramatic gain in the number of female leaders over 5 years. Same thing is true when you bring in diversity managers. When there's a chief diversity officer especially, who reports right to the CEO, you get a major spike in the number of women who are given the chance to lead. And these are the kinds of steps that I think we need to see happen. Now, when you look at who adopts these kinds of activities, and in particular what kinds of men are supportive, it turns out there's a staggering daughter effect. That men with daughters, male CEOs in particular with daughters, are more likely to support women's rights, are more likely to champion diversity. And I thought this was great news. We see that male CEOs pay their employees more generously if they have daughters, especially their female employees. That they're more corporate social responsibility concerned and they make more investment in those kinds of programs. We also see it in politics, that legislators and voters with daughters are more supportive of reproductive rights. We see it in venture capital, that when partners have daughters, they are more likely to bring women into their firms. And they're also more successful, by the way. And I thought this was fantastic news for a long time. Because let's face it, a lot of men are going to have daughters, and that means we're going to see a lot more men support women. I have to tell you that after a few years of being excited about this evidence, I now think this is shameful and embarrassing. Why couldn't you care about your daughter, not your daughter, your sister, your mother, your friend, your aunt, your niece? Why did you have to have a daughter in order to care about half of the population of planet Earth? I don't think we should let men get away with saying, as the father of a daughter, I care about the following. I think what it's time to do is have a bunch of men say, as a human being, I care about women's rights. Thank you.